30 seconds until minions spawn. Minions have spawned. been slain. Has been slain. An ally has been slain. An enemy has been slain. An enemy has been slain. Your team has destroyed a turret. An enemy has been slain.
yourself in downtown Los Angeles. Today, it's a sprawling landscape of concrete and asphalt with a population of 12.5 million people. But 30,000 years ago, things were really different. Back then, LA was home to Ice Age beasts like mammoths, saber-toothed cats, and dire wolves. Instead of on a sidewalk, you're standing in a wilderness of sagebrush. The trees around you are Monterey pine and cypress. Nearby, there's a river lined with sycamore and a royal willow. Now, these plants may be familiar to Californians today, but the animals that lived among them, well, it's pretty wild around here. Off to your left, a Shasta ground sloth rears up on its hind legs. It stands over 10 feet tall as it bends down the branches of trees to munch on their leaves. And the air around you is cool, cooler than modern-day LA. And there's a familiar smell in the air. The air smells like asphalt, like a freshly paved road on a warm day. And as you follow the smell, you come across cracks in the ground, where a thick, black, tar-like substance oozes from the earth, sometimes spreading out in huge, inky pools. This goo has been bubbling up since around 50,000 years before our time, a byproduct of intense heat acting on layers of shale deep under Los Angeles. Shale that was deposited millions of years ago, when the LA basin was all underwater. And as you walk carefully around these pools and ponds of natural asphalt, you come across a sad and striking scene. A young bison is stuck fast, unable to escape. And if you've ever seen a nature documentary, you probably know what happens next. As the little bison struggles against the tar and cries out, you hear something else. Other animals approaching. From the barks and growls, it sounds like a pack of dogs. But as they come into view, you can see that these hunters are big. They're much larger and stockier than modern wolves. It's a pack of dire wolves, the most common predator in the area. And they're here for the bison. And this whole natural dynamic is part of what makes La Brea such an interesting site. Predators were drawn in by trapped prey and ended up getting trapped themselves. And scenes like this happened over and over, say once a decade or so, for thousands of years, leaving behind the abundance of fossil bones that are found at the site today. Along with more than 4,000 dire wolves, paleontologists have found 3,000 saber-toothed cats, 2 species of giant ground sloth, over 300 bison, and more than 100,000 fossils of birds, ranging from songbirds to eagles and condors. Many of the other charismatic megafauna of the Pleistocene are here too. Extinct camels, American lions, short-faced bears, and lots of smaller carnivores, like coyotes, and herbivores, like peccaries. But while some of these species, like the little bison, are really common, others, like llamas and tapirs, are very rare. And there's also a single, solitary specimen of a very familiar organism that's been found in this black goo. An ancient human. Hello and welcome to Eon's Mysteries of Deep Time, a podcast about some of the most perplexing problems and unanswered questions about life in the ancient past. I am Blake DePastino, co-host of PBS Eons, a YouTube channel about the history of life on Earth. And I'm talking to you today about the famous La Brea tar pits and one of the mysteries they hold in their depths, the story of La Brea Woman. La Brea Woman is the name given to the only human specimen ever excavated from the La Brea tar pits. Now, I've been to La Brea a number of times, and I've been writing about archaeology and paleontology in the American West for years, and yet I'd never heard of her. So, how can that be? Well, a lot of it certainly has to do with the sensitivity that surrounds the study of Native American remains. They're currently being held in the collections of the George C. Page Museum at the tar pits. But much of the obscurity of this woman also has to do with the fact that, even after more than a century of study, we know almost nothing about her. From when in history she actually lived, to how old she was when she died, to the cause of her death, and the reason that her remains ended up in the tar. Nearly every aspect of this woman's life has been an elusive, shifting narrative. Before we get too far into this mystery, let's explore the pits themselves. Today, the La Brea tar pits are an active paleontological site, where scientists are still excavating and studying 50,000 years of Southern California's history, one fossil at a time. And those fossils are preserved by a process that's still taking place, one you can actually witness in real time. This natural asphalt is still constantly bubbling up all over the grounds of the tar pits and its museum. It creeps up in the pavement of the parking lot. It seeps out of the little holes that form in the grass. And it continues to roil in the bigger pools, which, by the way, are cordoned off to keep you from becoming their next victim. But people have been fascinated by these tar pits for a long time. Native Americans living in the area for thousands of years used the sticky tar for waterproofing and as an adhesive. And they, like modern visitors, sometimes just lost stuff in the pits, like pendants and hairpins. Starting in the 1870s, the seeps were mined for asphalt and drilled for oil. And in 1875, animal bones found in the pits were recognized as fossils. Soon after that, scientists started to excavate. Throughout the late 1800s and early 1900s, researchers uncovered many of the same megafauna that are still coming out of the tar pits today: saber-toothed cats, giant ground sloths, and dire wolves. And then, in 1914, a new kind of fossil was found: the partial skeleton of a woman. But who she was and how she ended up in the tar are where the mystery starts. Was her presence in the pit just an accident or something else? Studies of her bones over the last century have raised as many questions as they've answered. She was originally described in 1914 by paleontologist John C. Merriam as being small, middle-aged, and probably female. But most of his description focused on her geological age. From the size and anatomy of her skull, along with the types of animal remains found in the same pit, he determined that she was likely a modern human that lived sometime after the end of the Pleistocene epoch, 11,700 years ago. In his paper, Merriam wrote,
"The characters of the human remains taken by themselves indicate that this person lived either within the present or recent period, or at a time not earlier than the end of the Pleistocene period immediately preceding it."
And that was actually a pretty good guess, especially for the early 20th century. It's only been in the last decade or so that researchers have come up with radiocarbon dating methods that can give us precise ages for these fossils, ones uncontaminated by the incredibly old carbon in the tar. More studies of La Brea woman's remains were conducted in the 1930s and 50s, and they agreed with Merriam's assessment of her geological age. She was younger than the megafauna found in nearby deposits, but how much younger remained an open question until 1971. That year, bone tissue from one of her femurs was used to date her to around 9,000 years old, making La Brea woman one of the oldest sets of human remains in North America at the time. And at some point before the 1980s, she was also diagnosed as having died from a severe sinus infection, based on the eroded appearance of the bone in those parts of her skull. But another idea about her death was about to emerge, and this one was more sinister. In 1981, two researchers, an anthropologist and a paleopathologist, published a thorough description of La Brea woman's skeleton, estimating her age, sex, and stature using newer methods. And again, they agreed that she had likely been a short woman. But rather than being middle-aged, they thought that she died between the ages of 25 and 30, based on the amount of wear on her teeth. And their careful examination of her bones revealed something else: fracture lines on her skull, from the orbit of the left eye to the right lower jaw and the right parietal bone. Her life had not been cut short by a sinus infection, they said, but by a blow to the head. She was, to use the researchers' rather sensational words, the victim of, quote, the oldest known North American homicide. They even speculated that a stone tool called a mano that was found close to the remains might have been the murder weapon, and that both the body and the stone were thrown into the asphalt in an effort to conceal the crime. The researchers concluded their report this way.
This particular skeleton, dated at over 9,000 years BP, gains its importance as one of the oldest homicides, if not the oldest homicide, in the New World. It's likely that she was murdered, evidenced by the fracturing of the cranium, and then her body thrown into the tar pits, perhaps to conceal the deed.
But here's the thing. The tar pits are what's known as an active depositional environment. Remains that find their way in turn around over time, rubbing against other material and the sides of the pits. And this can create scratches and grooves and even fractures on bone. So the idea that La Brea woman was the victim of America's first murder is almost certainly just a sensationalized story. The marks found on her skeleton were likely caused by the normal action of the pit itself. So the question remained unanswered. How did she end up in the pit? A few years later, in 1985, a researcher proposed that La Brea woman represented a reinterment, that she died, was interred somewhere else for a period of time, and then was reburied in the pits, along with ceremonial offerings like the mano and some polished shells that had been found near her. And part of this notion was based on the skull of a small dog that had been discovered in the same pit as her remains. According to this paper, dogs were buried alongside people in a number of cultures in the Americas to provide the deceased with some kind of supernatural support. So maybe that was what was going on here too. In the words of the researcher,
reassessment of all available data related to the human remains indicates that this occurrence represents a reburial rather than an accidental entrapment or the disposal of a homicide victim.
In the span of 4 years, the La Brea woman had gone from being a homicide victim that had been dumped in the pits to a person reburied with care and ceremony. And her age at death was about to change as well. In 1989, another anthropologist took a closer look at her skeleton and concluded from the development of her teeth and bones that she was probably younger than 25 to 30 when she died, more like 17 or 18. That's where things stood for just over 2 decades, and it made a compelling story. An ancient teenager and her dog, intentionally entombed in the tar. But the rise of newer methods of analysis would challenge even that narrative. In 2016, the remains of both La Brea Woman and the dog were radiocarbon dated, and the results were surprising. La Brea Woman was actually around 1,000 years older than she was thought to be, dating back 10,200 years, while the dog was only around 3,300 years old. So, it seemed, if she really was reburied, the dog wasn't part of that. And it's still unknown if the mono and the shells were directly associated with her. They're just more pieces of the puzzle surrounding her life and death. Whatever the circumstances were that led to the presence of La Brea Woman in Pit 10, the experts wrote, they did not include the intentional associated burial of a domestic dog. But that study also looked at the ratios of various isotopes of carbon, nitrogen, and sulfur in her skeleton to try to figure out what her diet was like. And these results were, like so many things about La Brea Woman, surprising. She seems to have had a land-based diet, one without any marine protein, which is odd considering how close she lived to the Pacific Ocean. And we know people in the area used boats. The tar pits themselves were a source of waterproofing material. So like I said, studying the remains of the La Brea Woman always seems to lead to as many questions as it answers. And that's the way studying the past goes. But here's what I think is the more operative question. Do the details of La Brea Woman's death really matter? Should this be the mystery of the La Brea tar pits that we keep coming back to? Or should we be asking bigger questions? The time when La Brea Woman lived came hot on the heels of a huge extinction of North American megafauna at the end of the Pleistocene. What would that world have been like? And would it have lessons for this world, today? And what was her life like? What were the lifeways of her people? What were their habits and rituals? What did she believe? How did she view the world? To me, what we don't know about how La Brea Woman lived is even more interesting than what we don't know about how she died. And that's what I learned about perhaps one of the most mysterious, compelling, and controversial discoveries from one of America's most famous fossil sites. Because of a whole series of flukes, from the tar pits forming in the first place to countless thousands of animals wandering into them, those pits preserve 50,000 years of North America's history. So I'm sure there's lots more where that came from. And what I find so interesting about La Brea Woman is she reminds us that even in one of the most productive fossil sites in America, there's still a lot to learn. Deep in the pools of asphalt under the city of Los Angeles, there are lessons that we can carry with us into the future. This episode was written by Dr. Darcy Shapiro, hosted by me, Blake DePastino, fact-checked by Callie Moore, and recorded by Joseph Tuna Medish. Our editor was Seth Radley, and sound design was by Callie Dishman. The show was produced by Seth Radley and Nick Jenkins. Our supervising producer is Nicole Sweeney, and our managing editor is Dr. Darcy Shapiro. The executive in charge for PBS Digital Studios is Maribel Lopez, and PBS Digital Studios Associate Director of Programming is Nikki Walker. Special thanks to Dr. Emily Lindsay and Dr. Amy Gussick. Eon's Mysteries of Deep Time is a production of Complexly for PBS Digital Studios, and we are distributed by PRX. Thank you all for listening to our premiere episode. Tune in next time when we will recount an unsolved mystery about the discovery of fossils in England that could have been the scientific discovery of the century, but instead turned out to be an elaborate hoax. Until then, you can always visit us over at youtube.com/eons for more stories from Deep Time. The story of life on Earth is full of mysteries. Like, would we even recognize the first dinosaur if we found it? Who was behind the fraudulent fossils of the so-called Piltdown Man? And why did they do it? And how did the bones of an ancient woman end up in a tar pit in downtown Los Angeles? Hi, I'm Blake DePastino from PBS Eons. You might know Eons from our YouTube show where I host alongside Callie Moore and Michelle Barboza Ramirez. And today we want to invite you to our new podcast, Eons Mysteries of Deep Time. From the dawn of the dinosaurs to the caves of South Africa's cradle of humankind, we're covering what we know and what we still don't know about natural history.
been slain. Enemy killing spree. Your team has destroyed a turret. An ally has been slain. An enemy has been slain. turret has been destroyed. Enemy killing spree. Enemy double kill. Has been slain. Your turret has been destroyed. Been slain. Welcome to Summoner's Rift. Seconds until minions spawn. Minions have spawned.
It's 1908 or maybe 1909, and you're walking down a farm road somewhere in southeast England. You notice that the road has recently been repaired with chips of a brownish rock that seem out of place. You've studied a little geology, so you ask around in the nearby village to find out where the rock came from. It turns out that it came from a gravel pit on a farm close to where you'd been walking. You decide to head back out there and visit the pit, and when you arrive, there are 2 workers digging out more gravel for road repairs. You make conversation, asking them if they found anything interesting. You're also a bit of an amateur archaeologist, and you want to know if they've encountered bones or fossils, and if they'll hang on to them for you if they do. They don't have anything for you this time, but you keep visiting, hoping something will turn up. And eventually, something does. One of the workmen shows you what appears to be a piece of human skull. It's strangely thick and stained a dark brown color, like the rocks in the pit, and you immediately start searching through the gravel for more pieces. But you don't find anything else. Still, you're convinced enough that there must be more to discover that you keep coming back to the pit. And in the fall of 1911, your persistence pays off. As you look through the piles of dirt and rock left behind by the diggers, you spot another piece of bone, part of the same skull, and you realize you might be holding something important, part of the skull of an ancient human ancestor. You take your finds to the Keeper of Geology at the British Museum of Natural History, a paleontologist named Arthur Smith Woodward. He's thrilled and impressed by your discoveries, and the 2 of you arrange for further excavations. Back at the gravel pit, you and a team of workers continue digging. You go through the discarded dirt piles, and you dig up and sieve the undisturbed layers of the pit. In the piles, you find more fragments of that same skull, and in the pit, you uncover the right half of an ape-like jawbone, and Smith Woodward finds yet another piece of that skull. Based on where they were found, you think they must go together. You also turn up some bones and teeth from ancient animals, and what appear to be a few stone tools, too. In December of 1912, you present your finds to a packed meeting of the prestigious Geological Society of London, concluding that they're 500,000 years old. The fossil is named Eanthropus dawsoni, Dawson's Dawn Man, in your honor. It's the scientific discovery of the century, just what everyone's been looking for to shine a light on human origins, especially in England. It's the kind of thing that could get you elected as a Fellow of the Royal Society, the United Kingdom's National Academy of Sciences. But not everyone in the scientific community is convinced, and they are right not to be. Because the so-called fossil human you claim to have discovered is a fake, and how you happen to come across it, well, it certainly sounds like a good story. Instead of the find of a lifetime, what you've really started is a mystery that will outlive you. What we now call the Piltdown Man hoax. Hello, and welcome to Eons, Mysteries of Deep Time, a podcast about some of the most perplexing problems and unanswered questions about life in the ancient past. I'm Callie Moore, co-host of PBS Eons, a YouTube channel about the history of life on Earth. Today's episode is a mystery in the most classic literary sense of the word. It's a whodunit detective story that spans more than a century. The saga of the Piltdown Man hoax. From that gravel pit in Sussex, we'll follow the faked fossils through history to what's now the Natural History Museum in London, where scientists are using new technologies to try to unravel the identity of the fraudster. We'll meet 3 of the prime suspects. Charles Dawson, an amateur fossil hunter with grand scientific ambitions. Martin Hinton, a museum volunteer with a grudge. And Pierre Thiers de Chardon, a French Jesuit priest known to be a joker. We'll hear the arguments for and against their involvement and explore how this hoax impacted the study of human origins. This story has everything, from old-timey science drama to workplace politics, and even an accusation of the creator of Sherlock Holmes himself, Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. While there's no question that the Piltdown Man was a forgery, as for who done it and why, well, there may yet be evidence out there that could put this mystery to bed once and for all. If we could just find it. When Dawson and Smith Woodward presented their finds at the Geological Society meeting, they made headlines, and many British paleontologists were very willing to believe that the fossils were genuine. But other experts in the US and continental Europe were skeptical. It would take more to convince them, like uncovering additional fossils at Piltdown, which Dawson and Smith Woodward and others would go on to do. In 1913, for example, a canine tooth was found that matched the tooth Smith Woodward had sculpted in his reconstruction of the original fossils for that first presentation. Because he thought the so-called Eoanthropus represented a missing link between humans and apes, he'd modeled the canine as being intermediate in size and shape between the two. And that's just what the new Piltdown canine looked like, found by the Jesuit priest named Thierry de Chardin, who'd helped out with earlier excavations at the site. In 1915, Dawson claimed to have found a second fossil site, just 2 miles or 3.2 kilometers from the Piltdown gravel pit. It contained additional skull pieces and a molar that looked a lot like the original material. And then, in 1916, Dawson died, and no other fossils were ever found at Piltdown. But their impact didn't die with Dawson, because Piltdown Man's large brain and ape-like jaw seemed to fit in perfectly with the other fossils of human ancestors known from Europe at the time. These included Neanderthals from Germany and France, and the ancient Homo sapiens fossils from Cro-Magnon, also in France, all with relatively large brains. So when anatomist Raymond Dart announced his discovery of a much different-looking human ancestor from South Africa in 1925, the famous Australopithecus africanus fossil called the Tong Child, prominent paleontologists in the UK were quick to criticize. They dismissed the small-brained fossil as irrelevant to human origins. But over the next 2 decades, as more and more small-brained hominin fossils were excavated in South Africa, they became impossible to ignore. And it became increasingly difficult to see how Piltdown Man's odd combination of features fit in with the newly emerging understanding of our evolutionary history. While discoveries elsewhere in the world had started to erode Piltdown Man's relevance to the story of human origins, scientists back in London were about to put it to bed for good. In 1949, a new technique for dating fossils had been developed, and Kenneth Oakley, a geologist at the Natural History Museum, decided to apply it to the Piltdown fossils. To his surprise, they turned out to be much younger than Dawson and Smith Woodward had suggested, and that raised some red flags. So he enlisted the help of 2 other experts to re-examine the material, and what they found would have Piltdown Man making headlines again. In 1953, they published a paper exposing the fossils as deliberate fakes. The jaw actually came from an orangutan and had been broken in exactly the right places to keep its real identity a mystery, even to scientists familiar with primate anatomy. The teeth had been filed down to give them a human-like wear pattern. The skull fragments seemed to come from a recent human, though they were on the thick side. And all the so-called fossils had been stained to match each other and the color of the Piltdown gravel. Every one of the finds from the site had been planted. The supposed missing link was finally revealed as a hoax. But who was behind it and why? In the almost 70 years since the forgery was uncovered, at least a dozen different people have been named as suspects, by themselves or in combination, with motives ranging from personal grudges against members of the scientific establishment to the whole thing being just an elaborate practical joke that went too far. As far as proof goes, some of the cases rest mostly on circumstantial evidence, while others are more convincing. The case against Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, the writer behind Sherlock Holmes, for example, includes him living very close to the Piltdown gravel pit, having the necessary connections through which to get the kinds of fossils that were planted there, and a line in his novel The Lost World about being able to, quote, fake a bone as easily as you can a photograph. For the 3 prime suspects, however, there's more behind the accusations. Take Charles Dawson, the discoverer of the so-called fossils. Being the person who found the first of them, and the fact that no more appeared after his death, makes him an obvious potential hoaxer. His motive? Scientific acclaim. He wanted to be a fellow of the Royal Society. He wrote more than 50 papers in pursuit of this goal and was even nominated as a fellow, but was never elected to the society. One author writing about the hoax suggested that sibling rivalry was ultimately behind Dawson's ambition. His younger brother had been knighted and became a baronet. And the case against him is pretty clear. He was the only person who was present at all of the so-called discoveries from both Piltdown sites, and he was later revealed to be behind at least 38 other archaeological forgeries. Dawson clearly had the means and opportunity to carry out the fraud, and he'd hardly be the first or the last person to fake scientific results for the sake of recognition. But there's one interesting wrinkle in his case. The two other prime suspects both allegedly said Dawson wasn't the hoaxer, but they knew who was. So what about the two of them? Martin Hinton worked as a volunteer in the Department of Geology at the Natural History Museum from 1910 to 1916, which was generally when the Piltdown hoax took place. In 1911, he wrote a letter to Smith Woodward, who was the head of that department, asking about payment for the work he was doing and maybe even regular employment. Smith Woodward refused, and a possible motive was born. By late 1917, Hinton had left the geology department for zoology, which hired him in 1921. He eventually rose to the post of keeper of zoology from 1936 to 1945. Becoming staff at the museum would have been a reason for him not to expose the hoax. It would have embarrassed his employer along with Woodward. Now, there are accounts of Hinton having visited Piltdown while the excavations there were in progress, and later suggestions that he tried to implicate Deschardins as the hoaxer. There are also old letters that describe his unhappiness with Smith Woodward and the situation in the geology department. But the strongest piece of evidence comes from the 1978 discovery of old trunks stashed in the attics of the Department of Zoology, directly above Hinton's old office. They contained mammal bones and teeth that looked a lot like what had been found at Piltdown. Several of the pieces had been carved in a way that looked identical to one of the artifacts that accompanied the so-called fossils from the site, and they were all stained the same chocolate brown as the Piltdown material. And the discovery of the trunks led to a second stash of human teeth, hidden away in a tobacco tin among Hinton's personal effects after his death. Based on the bones in the trunks and the additional teeth, Hinton seemed to know, or he just figured out, both of the methods the hoaxer used to treat the Piltdown material to make it look old. But was this proof of Hinton faking the fossils to try to embarrass Woodward, or did it mean he was trying to figure out how it was done in order to figure out who did it? And why did he try to point the finger at Deschardins multiple times? What role did he play? Thierry Deschardins was a Jesuit priest and a paleontologist, and at least one scholar who knew him described him as a joker. During the main Piltdown discoveries, he was based at a seminary relatively close to the site and participated in the excavations there. He even found the canine tooth in 1913 that helped quiet some of Piltdown Man's original critics. But almost immediately after Dawson and Smith Woodward had presented the first so-called fossils to the Geological Society in December of 1912, he'd written to Akali, quote, "We must do nothing. We must wait for the criticisms that will follow." Which seems odd, especially given that in 1920 he suggested that part of the Piltdown Man's jawbone seemed intentionally broken, well before anyone else suspected the fossil was fake. And in several papers he wrote about human evolution before the hoax was revealed, he seemed to have referenced Piltdown Man as little as possible, a strange way to treat a supposedly important fossil. Either Deschardins was skeptical on the scientific merits of the material, or he knew it wasn't real. His possible motive is less clear than Dawson's or Hinton's, which weakens the case against him. It's been suggested that he might have realized Dawson had faked finds before and was trying to set him up again, potentially through an accomplice with access to an orangutan jaw. So with all of the prime suspects dead for at least over a half century at this point, where does the cold case stand? Well, a paper published in 2016 by a team based at the same museum where Hinton and Woodward worked used DNA analysis and CT scans to try to solve the whodunit once and for all. Based on its DNA, they found that the ape material used for the Piltdown jaws and teeth probably came from a single Bornean orangutan. They weren't able to extract any DNA from the human bones, but determined that they likely came from 2 or 3 different people, possibly from medieval times. Using CT scans, they also found that a number of the so-called fossils were filled with gravel, held in place with plugs made of pebbles and dental putty. The gravel was similar to what's found at Piltdown and would have helped make the bones feel heavier, as fossils weigh more than unfossilized bone. Ultimately, they concluded that the hoax was the work of a single forger. They point to Dawson, based on the consistency of their methods and the limited number of specimens used. And while that's all that science can tell us right now, there's still one thing left that might solve the mystery. A letter. Thierry Deschardins allegedly wrote a letter that was only supposed to be opened after his death. It was deposited in a bank somewhere, but was never found, so the missing piece to this whole puzzle might still be out there. In the end, the Piltdown Man hoax is a story about how science gets done and how it can self-correct. It's also a story about human expectations and biases, ones that set the study of our evolutionary history back a couple of decades. And we still care about it because we care about possibilities. We're compelled by mysteries that could still be solved. And this one gets at the heart of how we understand ourselves and what kinds of stories we're willing to tell and believe about our origins. This episode was written by Dr. Darcy Shapiro, hosted and fact-checked by me, Callie Moore. This episode was edited and mixed by Callie Dishman, and sound design was also by Callie Dishman. The show is produced by Seth Radley, our supervising producer is Nicholas Sweeney, and our managing editor is Dr. Darcy Shapiro. The executive in charge for PBS is Maribel Lopez, and Nikki Walker is PBS's Associate Director of Programming. Eons, Mysteries of Deep Time is a production of Complexly for PBS Digital Studios, and we are distributed by PRX. Tune in next time where we'll grapple with one of the biggest open questions in paleontology. What was the first dinosaur? Until then, you can always visit us over at youtube.com/eons for more stories from deep time.
From PRX.
Picture yourself in downtown Los Angeles. Today, it's a sprawling landscape of concrete and asphalt with a population of 12.5 million people. But 30,000 years ago, things were really different. Back then, LA was home to Ice Age beasts like mammoths, saber-toothed cats, and dire wolves. Instead of on a sidewalk, you're standing in a wilderness of sagebrush. The trees around you are juniper, Monterey pine, and cypress. Nearby, there's a river lined with sycamore and arroyo willow. Now, these plants may be familiar to Californians today, but the animals that lived among them, well, it used to be pretty wild around here. Off to your left, a Shasta ground sloth rears up on its hind legs. It stands over 10 feet tall as it bends down the branches of trees to munch on their leaves. And the air around you is cool, cooler than modern-day LA. And there's a familiar smell in the air. The air smells like asphalt, like a freshly paved road on a warm day. And as you follow the smell, you come across cracks in the ground, where a thick, black, tar-like substance oozes from the earth, sometimes spreading out in huge, inky pools. This goo has been bubbling up since around 50,000 years before our time, the byproduct of intense heat acting on layers of shale deep under Los Angeles. Shale that was deposited millions of years ago, when the LA basin was all underwater. And as you walk carefully around these pools and ponds of natural asphalt, you come across a sad and striking scene. A young bison is stuck fast, unable to escape. The story of life on Earth is full of mysteries. Like, would we even recognize the first dinosaur if we found it? Who was behind the fraudulent fossils of the so-called Piltdown Man, and why did they do it? And how did the bones of an ancient woman end up in a tar pit in downtown Los Angeles? Hi, I'm Blake DeFastino from PBS Eons. You might know Eons from our YouTube show, where I host alongside Callie Moore and Michelle Barboza Ramirez. And today we want to invite you to our new podcast, Eons, Mysteries of Deep Time. From the dawn of the dinosaurs to the caves of South Africa's cradle of humankind, we're covering what we know, and what we still don't know, about natural history.
enemy has been slain. An ally has been slain. An enemy has been slain. Your turret has been destroyed. Aced. An enemy has been slain. An ally has been turret has been destroyed. Your Double kill. Enemy is legendary. Been slain. Has been slain.
The year is 2063. The global currency is Moose Coin. You're refused entry into the Metaverse's Lambo Club because your Twitter profile picture is not enclosed in a nice saucerhedron. In a desperate bid to hold onto a square of pixels or land you bought in Elontopia, you must pay rent to Paris Hilton, who bought $17 billion worth of real estate with a picture of a monkey in 2033, and in a bid to become immortal has since replaced all of her organs with bionic hardware, each limb operated by its own smart contract. Citizens who own sliving tokens now have voting rights on her every move, from cooking mediocre lasagnas to overthrowing what is left of democracy. Jobs are obsolete, and by the time you get to the Meta Walmart, Moose Coin has crashed.
Hey, excuse me, guys.
Never take the goggles off.
But it's okay, because you're in control of who has your data now, and your dirty fiat currency didn't devalue by 2% over the entire year. That might be what happens if Web3 actually takes off, but it seems that for some reason, people actually want to stop this from happening? Welcome back to the Mooncat channel. Are you ready for another rabbit hole that would confuse the shit out of a small Victorian child? Oh, and if you're a crypto bro watching this video, yes, I'm about to FUD. I am gonna FUD so hard! To understand the intention behind Web 3, you need to understand Web 1 and Web 2. Those of you who don't have back problems might not remember Web 1, so let Grandma Moon explain. It involved Neopets, Netscape browsers, dedicating half of your desk space to your CRT monitor, watching Napster take 3 hours to download the latest Newfound Glory pop-punk hit in 96 kilobits per second, only to open it and find out that it's
2 girls, 1 cup.
physical fights with your siblings over who gets to use the landline, hamsterdance.com, chain emails that threatened you with a 7-year curse, janky browsers on your Sony Ericsson flip phone.
You've got mail.
It's a hyperlink to
Fancy.
signing in and out of MSN Messenger to try and get the attention of Brandon, Windows XP, writing surreal erotic fanfiction on the Good Charlotte forum with your emo punk friend.
You can hear the modem scream.
Yahoo! Malware, GeoCity.
Meat spin.
But then Web 2 came along. Now we have Google, Facebook, JavaScript, Google, Amazon, cookies, Google, Facebook, data harvesting, Facebook, Amazon, Google. Who put Bing there? Google, Facebook. But many people think that there's something new on the horizon, something to break us free from these large corporations and eliminate the middleman. And that's
The blockchain.
Now, how am I going to explain blockchain technology without making you all want to stab yourselves in the eyeballs? I'm going to have to Margot Robbie it, aren't I? Oh! Whoa! I don't have a butler, okay? Or a champagne flute, for that matter. Blockchain technology is a bit like... Imagine there was a really easy, quick way of making payments called, I don't know, Visa, right? But you thought, hey, why don't we replace this system with something else that doesn't involve a middleman, right? Because that's a problem that needs solving, and replace it with a system that uses more power than the Netherlands. Or say you want to pay one queen coin to Tracy, but instead of your phone sending one message to your bank, and then your bank checks the funds and then sends the funds to Tracy, your phone sends a message to a few 100,000 people, idling extremely powerful computers 24/7, playing a sort of extreme bingo. And then once one of the computers wins, the block of payments gets added to a ledger, and this creates a blockchain. And the winner of this stupid computer bingo gets a little reward of a fraction of a queen coin. And then 10 minutes and 400 kilograms of CO2 later, if you're lucky, and Tracy hasn't lost her passphrase, the silly bitch, she receives her queef coin. But now it's 10 minutes later, and one queef coin is worth about a tenth of what it was when you sent it. Or think of it like this. Instead of asking a trusted friend to oversee your queef coin transaction, you say, I would like to send you this queef coin, but in order to do so, I cannot put my trust into this friend. So instead, I will put my trust in thousands of strangers on a decentralized network that are actually mostly controlled by random millionaire tech nerds that own loads of shipping containers full of NVIDIA graphics cards in fucking Siberia or something. And why don't we burn down a forest at the same time just for fun? Yeah, it doesn't sound like it makes a lot of sense. And that's because it fucking doesn't! So this technology has been around since the 2008 market crash, touted as a solution to the problem of the